Have you ever wondered why men prioritize sex over emotional intimacy? Is it even true? We're going to dive into that today from both sides. Stay tuned. Welcome to Talkin' Sexes, where we break down gender, relationships, and society with a little bit of wit and a whole lot of real talk. I'm Jennifer Marie.
And I'm A Pariera. We're here to tackle the questions everybody's asking, whether they admit it or not.
From love and dating to the unwritten rules of masculinity and femininity, no topic is off limits.
And just so we're clear, this isn't about us versus them. It's about how we all navigate the world through different perspectives.
So, whether you're a man, woman, or just trying to figure it all out, pull up a chair because we've got a lot to talk about.
Let's get into it.
Everyone has always said that men prioritize sex over everything emotional. And A and I are going to talk today about is that is that really the truth? And you may be a little surprised. So, A, I'm kind of curious what is your take on this?
What do I think, or why do I think this happens?
I want to know, well, first off, good question. I want to know what from your personal life, with that, we can get into research later, but from your personal life, what have you experienced?
From my personal life, I've grown up in lots of guy groups and hung out with the dudes and things like that. So I've definitely been immersed and absorbed those kinds of conversations and just how they, prioritize those things and see women as well and objectify them and just that kind of language that they start using towards them when they start talking about sex. But I can't say I personally have taken on and seen women in that way. It's just been something that I've been very aware of and always question why and how do we get to that place in ourselves to start viewing other people in that way. It's not even just about women, it's just about just viewing another human and talking about them in that way and treating them in that way. I've always found fascinating, so I find this topic very fascinating to dive into because I've been around it, but I can't say I've personally been in it myself.
Okay. Okay. That makes sense. Well, I come from a very different angle. So I lived the first 37 years of my life as a man, or at least presenting as a man. And a lot of times I thought I was, um, but I came at this and I was the nice guy. I was the nice guy that everybody felt like they could trust and they really could. But even within that, I don't know if I think it was just the testosterone in my body, but there was so much in my body that everything was about sex. I mean, unless it was except for it was about my gender stuff too, let's be honest. But everything for they say that guys think about sex like every 7 seconds or whatever that is. It's I don't really hardly disagree with that. Uh that is something it really does consume your mind a lot, especially when you're on a lot of testosterone. When I suppressed that T and brought in the estrogen, my body started saying, "Wow, you don't really need that anymore." I think about sex in a very, very different way. But but I want to go back to the beginning of sex for me because I'm not going to shy about talk about anything on this show. Okay, so if you're uncomfortable, like I always make clear, this is not a show for kids. Most of the stuff that I do is for kids, but this is not for kids. So the first time I had sex was in college, and it was with a girlfriend, and it was with um, and there was that connection, and I thought that I was in love. But to be honest, just as a guy, I didn't. That's not something that I really needed. That wasn't. Um, it wasn't something that I needed. And honestly, I made the choice later on to have sex with a couple other women after that, and I was there first, and it kind of just became my thing for a little bit there. I don't know, it was weird, but everything just was about sex when I was living as a man. It was um, it just really did control my mind in a lot of that way. And it was and once I realized that once I had sex that I needed to do it again and again. Like the more you do it, the more that you need to have that feeling again and again. And as a guy, that release is super easy and it's very different. Um, so so I guess I'm not going to shy away from anything on this show.
It's
Um,
so fascinating. One time I was also in this like indigenous like circle. My wife is a nurse for this tribe, and we go to this circle. And I was talking about my experience and how I've come out not only once but twice. And like I talked about like the effects of testosterone and like how I experienced it the first time. And he just like stopped me for a second. He's like way older, probably like 70s or 80s, and he's like, I completely understand. He's like, I was just like everything when I was 20, it was all about sex and this and that and like destroy and blah blah blah. And then he's like, as I got older, my testosterone dropped, and I was like, wow, is this what it's like to experience life? So it is fascinating how those hormones like just make us operate differently. So maybe through this conversation, I'm thinking maybe it is more of a natural pull. Like maybe it is more of a natural thing that men are inclined to, whereas women aren't inclined to. So it's something that they have to learn to maybe moderate or self-control or whatever that might be, reflection, and think
yeah,
about how they're using it and things like that. But yeah, when I brought it up in a circle once, this older man was just like, yeah, I get it.
yeah. I will. Yeah, exactly. I will say that like as I I'd always heard people say that women, it's all about emotional for them. You know, it's all about having that emotional connection to, and that's what really creates that drive in the libido or whatever, you know, right? And to be honest, that's exactly how it is for me now. You know, I transitioned a couple years ago, and now I have no desire to have sex unless there is that emotional connection there. Um, that that is the biggest piece for me. I mean, sure, at times, you know, like I can see a hot guy, you know, um, and things can rise, you know, my excitement can kind of rise a little bit and things or whatever. Um, but yeah, it is something that is just very different. You know, like I've gone from this life where I was, you know, just living by the seat of my pants or whatever, you know, and just you see a hot girl or whatever, you want to do things with her, right? And then now it's like, oh, he did something really sweet for me. Like that's very different thing for me. I don't know. It's just very interesting.
It is very interesting. I wonder too what your thoughts or take would be on this, how much like maybe like family influences might have on this perspective as well. Like I grew up in a household that has pretty like stable marriages and just like healthy marriages all around. So I always, saw sex in that like more of like you're in love and do things like that. But I wonder like if I was like socialized and like raised as a boy, would I see it in that same way, or would I still see it in the way that guys do and are socialized to see it as?
Yeah, I was raised in a household where my parents are still together after I over 40 years now.
Mhm.
Um, and so yeah, I can see I had that really healthy relationship too, right? And but I still had that natural desire, you know, like but I think that we need to kind of take it back to things too, where because there is biology within this, I believe, but there is also that point where everyone has always said since I was younger, you know, that men are just sex driven, you know, and that's how we are. That's how you need to be, and that's how everybody expected it to be. So could that be part of this too?
Uh, I mean, that's a really great question, and I think about that from my experience very often because even though I say, like I said, I wasn't like necessarily in the experience, I still did take on a lot of those patterns, and it like almost became a mask for me. Like on the outside, I had this exterior of like I'm a cool like mask lesbian and like I could play all the girls and I could get any straight girl I want. Like that's kind of the lesbian that I was growing up. So I did take on a lot of those patterns from like hanging out with guys, and I talked about girls in not the same way but similar ways that they did because I thought that's what girls might like and things like that, even though I was just a masculine female growing up, I still took on those things. And I've had to really dive into myself and ask myself, like, why am I holding on to these things? Like, does this even make sense? And I've had to really like work through and heal and let go of a lot of those narratives, if that makes sense. Like, I would never personally go into a room, like, I personally couldn't go into a room and have sex with whoever, whenever kind of thing. Like, I've never been that person, and I just don't have it in me. So, like, sex has always been that for me, but when I go out and socialize with people, that's not always the persona that I would portray to have. Does that make sense?
It does. And when you talk about like going into a room and having sex with whoever, right? Even when I was living as a guy, for me, maybe that's different. Maybe that has to do with me and my truth. But I never had that desire to just that I or I was nervous about STDs and all kinds of other stuff, right? That I was never gonna have sex with somebody I didn't know,
Hmm.
and I still won't. You know, even more so nowadays. It's more like that. I need a connection there. That's super important to me.
Hmm.
So yeah, it's interesting. It's interesting to kind of think about like when did this start? Like, was it because it's a very challenging one of the things for me within this is it's very challenging whether you to determine whether it is biology or whether it is society.
Well, I think through the human experience, it's a mix of both for everything, right? Like how
Yeah,
babies raise, how we grow up as children. It's just like the human experience and development. It's half nurture and it's half nature. So even though it's like, your nature's pull to have more sex, if that's who you are, so be it. You also have to nurture yourself to learn and regulate that kind of stuff. You know what I mean? So I think it is always going to be a mix of both, and that's why I think these conversations are just going to be so fascinating. What is pulling from nature, and then what is pulling from society that we actually do have a little bit more control?
yeah, and that's why I wanted to have these conversations here, um, especially because I can dive into both sides of me and talk about because I lived 37 years presenting as a man, and now I've lived a couple years, almost, um, yeah, about 2 years presenting as a woman. So it's very different, um, but it's just like it's really hard to determine whether which one came first, because they kind of both came first to me at the same time. They kind of both came like where um, you turn into a teenager and then you get those hormones going um, and one thing I wanted to point out, so I got all these hormones going, right? And um, this is not. I want to make sure everybody understands this too. This is not a trans podcast necessarily. We're trying to give two different kind of perspectives, but I will give you my tidbits kind of along the way as well. So uh, the world makes everything sexual, everything, and so especially for men. And so when even though I was cross dressing since I was 4 years old, just made sense of it being about clothes. When I did turn into a teenager, I did start masturbating at that time too. Now, to be fully honest, it didn't get fully erect in hardly at all, but it was still a way to release that. It was a way that I was going to release the um that burden that I had. And then once I did, it didn't I didn't have that um I didn't have that thought anymore. That it was gone. And or at least for a while until it comes back up again. But it was kind of like a almost like a fix for me. So, and I've heard that's kind of been true for a lot of other trans women as well. Like the world makes everything about sex, right? And so it's easy to make it about sex when it's even yourself, even by yourself.
Absolutely. I think that's a fascinating topic for like the whole world to even think about and reflect on. Is like, what is like your connection, or like what is your connection with your sexuality and sexual self?
Right.
Because there's been so much research, like when you start talking about that, I think about all the nerd things that I've looked into and seen, but like so there's so because the world is so sexualized and sexualizes everything, there's so much sexual shame that exists in this world too. So that pull and the abuse when it comes to like sex and things like that, it's coming from a shameful place of not accepting some part of yourself deep down. And research and studies have really shown that, especially when it comes to men and like why they do the things they do when it comes to sex. It's because of the messages that they've been taking on from society, and then it doesn't feel true to themselves, and then they act out on these impulses in violent ways instead of healthy ways. And that might not be true for every man, but that's like a deeper level of like sexual shame and like what this kind of conversation can do to people at a deeper level when they
Absolutely.
do take on those like cultural and societal narratives.
Yeah. How 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 do you recommend someone who is struggling with processing with this kind of stuff? How do you recommend somebody kind of begin to start processing it?
As a member of the LGBTQ community, and it's not even just an LGBTQ problem, but when you struggle so much with your identity and your sexuality, and when it's just different from the world, you will find inside of this community that there is a lot of sexual shame. There's a lot of addiction to porn and things like that. And I will, be completely transparent. There was a time in my life where I had to deal with that, and I had to start being honest with myself and start seeing it as a problem, and instead of a way to, let go of my emotional release or whatever it might have been at the time. It was such a distraction from the feelings that I was feeling. It was always a way for me to like be like, okay, well, I'm uncomfortable in here. I'm going to go do that and I'm going to go release something. So it was kind of that repetitive thing that just became like almost like a habit. It became habitual. It would be the place to go. And that is true for a lot of people's experience in this world, whether they want to admit it or not. But I think that first step is admitting it to yourself and trying to help yourself and seeing what you can do. And if it is, hard to stop on your own, like be honest with yourself, give yourself compassion. Like it's more about the sexual shame and giving yourself time to explore that and open yourself up in new ways. So if you need help, so be it, go get help. But I think that very first step is seeing it like, no, this is a problem and there's something that needs to be healed inside of myself. There's something inside of me like asking for my attention. So I think that's the first step. And I've been through that myself, and I've also worked with a lot of my clients when I was doing transformational and mindset coaching inside the community. So many community members would open up to me in those ways. So when I started to learn that it wasn't just a me problem, this was like more of a human and humanity problem, it kind of gave me that feeling of validation, like I'm not alone in this. More people struggle with this than we want to talk about, kind of thing. So I think that's also helpful to mention. Like you're not alone in those struggles, no matter where you are and who you are.
Absolutely. I think a lot of people deal with shame, and shame is a huge topic, and we may even have talked about it in another episode. But it is a big thing, especially when it comes to sex or sexual gratification, and that is something that I even talked about like cross dressing. There was so much shame associated with that that I couldn't um, I couldn't tell anybody about it. That is a big thing, and I want people to understand that exploring things, it's okay and natural to explore. We need to stop putting a stigma on exploration. Exploration is how you find out who you are and what you like. So that is something that I just think is important, that we bury the shame and we dive in deep,
Mm.
and just kind of explore and then figure out why is that. That's what I do with my clients is like, well, why are you having these thoughts? Let's kind of dive in a little bit deeper into that, or where do you want your life to go? So, yeah, such an interesting topic. I would love for our listeners to comment on what are your thoughts on this? Like, what do you think comes first? I mean, do you think it is just biology? Do you think it's just society, or do you think that that there's a big combination? And when did it start for you? I'd love for people to share in the comments about when did this start, this topic? When did sexual um, prioritization uh, of emotional or just sex start for you? That's a wrap for this episode of Talkin' Sexes. If you love the conversation, hit that subscribe button so you don't miss what's coming next.
And we want to hear from you. Got a burning question or a hot topic you want us to tackle? Go to the Speak Pipe link in the show notes and leave us a message on our answering machine.
Who knows? Your question might just be the next big debate.
And before we go, a quick disclaimer. We're both entrepreneurs, but we're not here in a professional capacity. Everything that we share is based on our experiences and opinions, not professional advice. And as trans people, we want to be clear. We do not speak for the entire community. Everyone's journey is different and everyone is valid.
So take what resonates, leave what doesn't, and keep the conversation going.
Until next time, keep talking, keep questioning,
and keep breaking the rules.